People assume today that if you have $2 million, it's going to ensure a worry-free retirement, but that's not always the case. Today, I'm going to walk you through a real case study to see if $2 million is truly enough to retire comfortably and the strategies you can use to make sure that it lasts. But first, I'm Brad Lineberger, certified financial planner and founder of Seaside Wealth Management, here to help you get more out of life with your money. Let's dive in. So I've got George and Linda. I made up their names, of course, but these are real clients of mine. And George is, they're both 62 years old, and they both want to retire at 64. So we've got 2 years to make this happen, okay? And then the other really important assumption that we made is how long they're going to live. And nobody knows for sure, but we used national averages to come up with age 95 as their life expectancy. Now look, I know what you might be thinking. There's two schools of thought here. Some of you might be grateful and thanking me. Wow, yeah, thanks. You showed that I'm going to live 30 years in retirement. There's another group of you out there that you're mad. I don't want to live 30 years in retirement. Regardless of how you feel about it, the reality is you have a 50% chance of making it into your 90s. And as your financial planner, my biggest concern is that I want your money to make it there with you. So for clients, that's why we're assuming age 95 on the life expectancy. This is one of those variables and one of these assumptions that we can absolutely change for you. We can customize it. But for starters, that's where George and Linda are at today, okay? The one thing you should know about George and Linda is they love to travel. So let's take a look at some of their living expenses here. We've got $8,000 a month built in there for their core living expenses. And on top of that, we've got a $15,000 a year travel budget. And then we're gonna run that until George is age 80. Because you know, typically people start to slow down in their 80s, that's when we see it. And in retirement planning, there's the go-go years, which is when you first retire, you're on fire, you're having fun, you're still fit, you're healthy, you've got plenty of money, and you go and have a great time. Then there's the slow-go years where you start to slow down. That's oftentimes in your 70s. And then by the time you get to your 80s and beyond, those can start to turn into the no-go years. And I hope that's not the case for you, but for those reasons, we're gonna start to slow down the travel in their financial plan at age 80. On top of that, George is gonna retire at 64, and we've got 1 year of healthcare expenses. This, by the way, healthcare and taxes are gonna be your top 2 expenses in retirement. So you better be planning for this in your financial plan. So many people I see out there are not planning accurately for this. It's a big mistake that I see people make. So we've got 1 year of the healthcare expense, and then we factored in Medicare Part B, C, and D into the plan. Part A is free. Part B is your doctor visits, and there's a base premium. Watch out for IRMA. I've created some videos about how to avoid IRMA. It can make your Medicare very expensive. You're gonna wanna look into a Medicare Advantage or a Medigap plan, which is all part of this expense that we've built in for George and Linda. And then Part D is gonna be your prescription drug plan. So Medicare is good coverage, fairly reasonably priced, and that is factored in. And on top of that, we are factoring in federal and state taxes to the plan. So as I start to put that together for you, it begins to look like this. And we've got core living expenses of $8,000 a month. There's the mortgage eventually disappearing there in about 10 years. And then we have those other expense flows coming in. And as a quick reminder, those represent things like the annual travel, because they just love to travel. And we have indexed that to inflation. So you can see that that number is getting larger every year. We've got healthcare for the 1 year when George retires prior to going on Medicare. And then we've got Medicare, and there it is. So those other expense flows are coming in and they're accurately reflected in the plan. And when we put it together, you can see that their total expense number is really more like $141,000 this year when everything's factored in and we're looking at inflation. You can see how these numbers grow. And so by the time they're in their 90s, they're really gonna need almost $300,000 to give them the same lifestyle and purchasing power that $141,000 gives them today. And that's the real impact of inflation. Again, it's one of the mistakes I see people make who aren't planning properly, but you have to factor in the inflation effect because it's real and it can really reduce your purchasing power if you're not careful. Okay. So now with that, let's take a look at their balance sheet really quick so you can see what's going on for George and Linda. Like so many people, much of George's money is tied up into his 401k plan. That's really the largest account that he has. On top of that, Linda has a traditional IRA, and George and Linda both have some Roth IRAs right here. And then they've got a little bit of cash, and then they have this taxable brokerage account here. And for those of you out there, I think the combination of the cash and the taxable brokerage account, I'm going to show you later on in this what a great benefit having those two accounts really is for George and Linda, and how they can be a benefit for you. They're going to allow you to do some really good planning techniques. I'll give you some opportunities to do that. So hold that aside. I'll show you that later. They also own their home, and they do have that small mortgage of about $250,000 that they're heading into retirement. And that's a big decision for you. I know you're wondering, should we pay off the mortgage before we retire, or should we retire with the mortgage? Very personal question. I know what Dave Ramsey would say, big Dave Ramsey fan. He says, pay the thing off. Financial peace is about not owing anybody anything. But if you're one of the lucky people who refinanced your mortgage right around the pandemic, you probably have an interest rate that's less than 3%. That might be the case, one of the exceptions to Dave Ramsey's rule of when you might want to go into retirement with that really low interest rate. I mean, heck, you could take your cash and put it over at Charles Schwab and you're getting north of 4%. And if the interest rate on your mortgage is less than 3%, you're making money off the bank, really. So that's one of those times where maybe you consider not paying off the mortgage as you head into retirement. Very personal decision. There's no wrong answer here. I'm happy to help you think it through if you need a thought partner on that. But George and Linda decided after some careful examination, they're comfortable with this small mortgage. Their investment accounts were growing just fine. They had enough cash and taxable accounts to pay it off anyways. So that's the decision they made. So we did have to make an assumption as far as growth goes on their investments. And around here, we make very conservative assumptions just to be safe here. We'd rather under project on the growth and then and over deliver here. And so for George and Linda, they've got about $2 million liquid, and we've projected 5.5% growth, and which we think is low. We think they can do better than that, but the market's never guaranteed, of course. And you can see the red here. This is how much money that they need to take out of their investment portfolio every year to make this plan come to life. And the first thing I'll point out to you guys is you've spent your whole life saving, building, accumulating, doing a great job of saving. It's really odd, it's really awkward to start taking money out of the portfolio. For some people, that's hard to do because you're having to put on a different mindset. Shifting into the mindset of taking distributions and taking money out. And sometimes it's hard to watch the account go down if that's the case. And so in this case, Linda was really struggling with watching the dollars come out of the portfolio. But you can see, despite the distributions, we had such a solid plan in place that their investments were actually able to grow, or at least stay steady and really kind of hold their ground, if you will. And then as they aged, and they started slowing down and they stopped traveling a little bit, you can see that they ended up in the plan having more money at the very end of life than they had at the beginning. So at first blush, we can see they're in solid shape, $2.5 million. But before we pop the champagne and start high-fiving and hugging, we had to stress test the plan. Because if we know anything about markets, it's that markets never give us 5.5%, right? They give us, maybe they're up 20 and then they're down 18 and they're down 12 and they're up 25, but they never give us a straight 5.5%. So what we're doing here is we're looking at their plan, and this is them all the way out to 95, having $2.5 million left. And now we're gonna stress test this thing. And we're running this through 1,000 randomly generated scenarios, some really good and some really bad. And look at this. They have a 96% probability of not running out of money. Fantastic shape. There was one scenario here where if things went really, really well, they ended up with over $5.1 million left. Fantastic. There was another scenario over here where if things didn't go well, they ended up with about 1.4 million left. You can see it right here. And so in their situation, probability of 96%, look at this, we're happy. If we can get them to 82 or higher, we're happy. And I say this all the time. Clients look at me and go, 82? When I was in school, that was like getting a B. And I want my retirement to be an A+. And I would say that George and Linda have a rock solid A right here. But 82% does not mean that 18% of the time you run out of money. It simply means that 18% of the time we're going to have to make some adjustments, okay? So if we can get you to 82 or higher, we're very comfortable to send you into retirement, have a lot of confidence that you can pull this off. But in the case of George and Linda, they were just in solid shape. So when I see numbers like this, the first thing I want to ask is, well, can they spend more money? Because we know that their core living expenses were about $8,000 a month. And so I talked to George and Linda and I said, you know, what's your comfort level? Would you like to spend a little bit more money in your life? And they talked about it and they looked at each other and they said, absolutely. There's more trips we'd like to go on. We want to take the kids with us on some of these trips. We want to go to Africa on a safari. We want to go to Australia. We want to take the grandkids eventually. So I thought that was pretty cool. So what we solved for was how much extra money could they spend? And we found that they could spend about $9,000 extra per year every single year for the 31 years that we had projected in retirement. And they were thrilled about that. What we ended up doing, however, was we took it a step further and they said, you know, we don't need to spend that extra money when we're in our 80s and 90s. Let's spend more than that in our 60s, in our early 70s, and let's really maximize the time with the kids and grandkids and take these amazing trips. And then down the road when we're older, we probably won't travel. So that's what we ended up doing for George and Linda. But I just wanted to illustrate the point that you have a lot of options and you have a lot of flexibility. And you know, you can't take the money with you when you go. So it's good to have a plan and it's good to solve for what's possible, okay? And around here, you'll hear me talk a lot about how do we take a good situation? How do we go from good to great? How do we really ensure that we try to make this money last and we do wise things with our money? So I'm going to show you how George and Linda went from good to great. But first I got to show you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what I'm talking about is the good is that George and Linda were projected to have almost $2.6 million left at the end of life. That's great. But the bad and the ugly is that their lifetime tax bill was going to be about $604,000 over their life. And we looked at that and we said, well, how can we help to lower that lifetime tax bill so that they can keep more money in their pocket? So what we looked at was doing Roth conversions in the gap years. And those gap years are the years between when you retire and when required minimum distributions kick on. And so what we found here is that by doing Roth conversions, you can see the red, that's the extra tax that they pay during those gap years up front. But then the gray here, those are the required minimum distributions that are no longer as large as they once were because money was shifted early in retirement during the lower income tax years out of the traditional IRA. So when George retired, he ended up rolling his 401k over to an IRA, at least that's the plan. And then he's going to do Roth conversions out of that IRA, and that's what you see happening right here in the red. And ultimately, this strategy ended up saving them almost $74,000 in taxes over their lifetime, and it added over $91,000 to the portfolio just by being smart about doing Roth conversions. So it's a way to help you pay less in taxes and ultimately keep more in the portfolio in the tax-free bucket. And the nice thing is, by doing Roth conversions, if you have money that you want to get to the kids, what a great way to get money to the kids in the tax-free bucket. Way better to give money to the kids in a Roth IRA than a traditional IRA. It's still going to be subjected to the 10-year rule, the Roth will, just like a traditional IRA, but your kids can let that money grow for 10 more years in the tax-free bucket and then take all of it out in the 10th year, and it's totally tax-free. So you're building generational wealth here by just with some smart, savvy money moves early in retirement. The next thing we had to stress test for George and Linda, we needed to make sure that the amount of money that they were taking out of the portfolio was going to be a sustainable distribution rate. Now, we already solved that their probability of success is 100%, but I want to show you another exercise we went through as we looked at their investment portfolio, and then we solved for how much money needs to come out of the portfolio in order to sustain their lifestyle. We divided how much was coming out by how much they had, and we got a withdrawal rate. And in the first few years, when they still had the mortgage in the picture, that withdrawal rate was maybe a little bit higher than we wanted to see. In a perfect world, we'd keep the distributions to 4% or less. We shot a great video on the 4% rule, which explains that. But that's a very sustainable withdrawal strategy. And you can see that the first few years were higher than 4% here. However, down the road, we get back into the fours here as the mortgage starts to go away. We hang out here in the fours. And then as the portfolio continues to grow, we're really in the low fours at worst here for many, many years in retirement. So that was one vantage point that we looked at carefully is just that distribution rate. And there's many different ways to think about how you want to take money out of your investments. You can just do the 4% where you take 4% every year and you increase it for inflation. Or you can have a more dynamic withdrawal strategy, which says if there's years where the market does well, think about 2023, 2024, so far this year in 25. Those are years that you can take out more money from the portfolio. And then if markets are in decline, like 2022 or 2020, those would be years that you can take less out of the portfolio and then live on the extra money that you took out when markets were good. So that's a more dynamic withdrawal strategy. It's pioneered by Guyton. There's Guyton's guardrails essentially. And that's another way that we will approach this for our folks. So after looking at withdrawal strategies, after stress testing, after looking at ways to lower the tax bill by being strategic with Roth conversions, the final thing we looked at was the way the portfolio was invested. And earlier in the video, I explained that having a taxable account and a cash account was really helpful. It was those accounts that allowed George and Linda to live on those accounts and do the Roth conversions early on in retirement. So one of the best things you can do as you're preparing to transition into retirement is continue building your taxable investment account and your cash account. Those things are going to be what allows you to do the conversions that ultimately can save you a lot of money in taxes over your lifetime. So tuck that away for the future. Happy planning. Those are good strategies. And you know, George and Linda are going to have a really nice future. You can see that $2 million is going to be a fantastic number that they can retire on, but still, it's not excessive. They still have to be careful. They still have to do wise planning. And I encourage you, no matter where you're at on your journey, maybe you don't have $2 million today, maybe you have more than that. Careful planning goes a long way, regardless of where you're at. So if you have questions on this, or if you want a guide or a partner on this journey, get in touch with us. We would be happy to help you. We'd build a plan like this for you and happy to help guide you through the transition into retirement. And for a good video on Roth conversions, check this one out. I think you're going to like it.